Exploration. A journey that would have meant certain death for all of them if it hadn't been for the determination of one man, Sir Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton set sail on his ship Endurance in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. His aim, to cross the Antarctic continent by foot. The story of his expedition is so remarkable that if it had been published as fiction, it would have met with the criticism that such things don't happen in real life. But incredible adventures were something that Shackleton was destined for.
I always had a feeling that I was preparing myself for something. I dreamt prodigiously about big things ahead, big things in the nature of adventure. I must have been about 18 when I remembered about how there was a Cape Shackleton away in the North Pole, and how as a child I'd loved stories of polar adventures from the Illustrated London News. And I said to myself, one day I'm going to be an explorer.
Ernest Henry Shackleton was an explorer in the classic mold, utterly self-reliant, romantic, and just a little bit swashbuckling.
Shackleton definitely was my hero. I think above all heroes, he was the one that impressed me more.
No other explorer in that age ever went back 4 times. There was enough hardship for most people just to go once.
I think that there are a breed of people that are, you could almost say, natural-born survivors that have got a tremendous instinct for survival, and I think Shackleton was like that.
The ship Endurance, named after the Shackleton family motto, "By endurance we conquer," was reputedly one of the strongest wooden ships ever built, ideally suited for the icy conditions in the Southern Ocean. On board were 28 men and 67 sled dogs, all under Shackleton's command. The crew had entrusted their lives to Shackleton, and he had a reputation for putting his men first. He was also a good leader, if an unconventional one.
Shackleton didn't really fit into the typical Edwardian heroic mold of explorers. He wasn't brought up in a hierarchical, structured, maybe middle-class English village. He was brought up in a small village, close to a small village in Ireland, where, you know, everybody would have mixed with everybody. And I believe this influence sort of permeated, came through in Shackleton's character. That sort of flexibility, the openness, the honesty. And you weren't dependent on society's outward structures to make your way in life.
Shackleton joined the Merchant Navy at 16 years old, working his apprenticeship on square-rigged sailing ships in the treacherous seas round Cape Horn. It was there that he developed his taste for adventure, a flair for leadership, and an ability to remain calm in difficult circumstances. But he wasn't just a hardy sailor. Life at sea appealed to his romantic nature. He loved poetry and was inspired by the optimism of Browning and Kipling. And his years at sea fueled his passion for the wide open spaces and the freedom and challenge they offered him.
I remember how as a small child my mind was haunted by the sea. The very word for me meant an unreasoning passion. It was the sea that kept calling me at school. It always rang in my mind with the thought of freedom. I wanted to be free.
but he was always on the lookout for new challenges. As he grew older, life in the merchant navy appealed less to his flamboyant nature. It was replaced in his affections by exploration. In 1901, he joined an expedition to Antarctica with Robert Falcon Scott, and his love affair with this icy continent began. If he could find success in this great wilderness, it would open the door to fame and fortune. In 1911, Norwegian Roald Amundsen claimed the South Pole, beating Robert Falcon Scott by almost a month. Scott and his men died on the journey back. Now there was only one prize left for any self-respecting polar explorer.
It is the last great polar journey that can be made. It will be a greater journey than the journey to the pole, and I feel it is up to the British nation to accomplish this, as we've been beaten to the North and South Poles. Then now remains the largest and the most striking of all journeys, the crossing of the continent.
The expedition was audacious. If it hadn't have been, it wouldn't have appealed. But this was the heroic age of exploration, where the competition was between man and nature, and man and the limits of human endurance. It could be said that the expedition was for the greater glory of Shackleton, but that would do him a disservice. He was motivated by the spirit of adventure. Antarctic exploration appealed because it was a challenge.
Being on a mountain or being in the Antarctic is a very uncomfortable business. It's cold, miserable, the wind blows, you're often short of food, you sometimes get lost. And a good deal of the time is not very pleasant at all. The only reason you have for going there is to overcome those problems.
The Antarctic is a strange mix of beauty and misery. It is white, it's cold, it's empty, it's boring, it's hard work. But it's also an open space of huge dimensions. It has huge skies, beautiful mountains. It's an odd place with an odd attraction.
The appeal of the Antarctic to Shackleton, it was the challenge of unexplored territory, I think, above all. And then overlaid on that was the sheer magic of the place. And I think he was very inspired by that challenge, or maybe a struggle with nature, if you like.
They headed south into the Weddell Sea, hoping to land the shore party at Vassal Bay. Shackleton had taken along an Australian photographer, Frank Hurley, to film the expedition. But what he ended up filming was not what Shackleton or his crew expected. Battling through the pack ice, the ship headed for the landing site where they would start the continental crossing. But Shackleton and his team would never set foot on the Antarctic continent. "80 miles short of their destination, the sea completely froze over. The men tried to cut a path through the ice so the ship could pass. but this was a lost cause. The Endurance was stuck fast. As the ship's storekeeper wrote in his diary, we were frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. There were two possible outcomes to this disaster. The expedition would continue if the ice broke, or the pressure of it would crush the ship. All they could do was sit and wait.
By this time, if fortune had smiled upon the expedition, we would have been comfortably and securely established on our shore base. But now, it is not easy to forecast our future. We may be able to reach a suitable spot to attempt the overland journey next year, but time alone will tell. I do not think any member of the expedition is disheartened by our disappointment. All hands are cheery, and in the meantime, we must wait.
Being trapped must have been a bitter disappointment for Shackleton. At 40 years old, in debt from the trip, he knew this would be his last opportunity for a great polar journey. But that was not all. Shackleton knew this was a potentially lethal situation. The fate of the Endurance was unknown to the outside world, and they would remain prisoners of the ice for the long Antarctic winter. Shackleton knew the problems of being in such a remote place. On his last expedition in 1908, he had walked to within 100 miles of the South Pole, the furthest south any explorer had been. He had to turn back or lose his men. Because of that, he became a national hero. But that added to the pressure. His position in society was not assured. It depended on him continuing to shine as a personality, and he needed to come back with a success. His position and his livelihood depended on it.
Shackleton has been called a fortune hunter. To me, I'd like to put it differently. He was a great entrepreneur. He was always thinking up of schemes to raise money, because he was always short of cash, either to pay for the last expedition or to pay for the next one. I always feel that he'd have a wonderful time with credit cards. Would have solved a lot of his problems.
If there was going to be any chance of attempting the crossing the following year, he would have to give his men no cause for alarm. So ship's business carried on as usual. The crew began to prepare the ship for the months ahead, storing seal blubber for fuel and penguin meat. But working in these conditions isn't easy.
A big part of the challenge in doing anything in such an environment is psychological rather than physical. And to make yourself keep moving day after day, well, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, it's very, very hard indeed. And I'm sure that, at least half, if not more like 3/4 of the strength you need is in your head. Spending time with the other people on expeditions can be a source of stress. There's a lot of interpersonal pressures on you. On the one hand, you've got these tensions. On the other, you're also relying on each other, and you have the most incredible strength in camaraderie.
The fact that the crew were kept occupied added to the feeling of contentment that pervaded the ship. Shackleton remained the image of cheerfulness, optimism, and calm. But in private, he must have been worried. Of all the enemies, the cold, the ice, the sea, he feared none more than demoralization.
Strong leadership is my only weapon. On that depends the sanity of my brave companions.
He was part of a society that believed in dignity and restraint. He had got his men into this predicament, and he would get them out through grim determination, if nothing else.
To show the British stiff upper lip is the only way that I can see that we have a chance of surviving.
If the crew became depressed or lost faith in their leader, they would not pull together. If they did not pull together, they would all perish. For the next 11 months, the ice drifting on ocean currents dragged the ship further away from land. With every day, Shackleton's crossing of Antarctica became more and more unlikely. But somehow, the months of waiting drew the men closer together. Despite the cold, the meager rations, and the diet of penguins, the months passed almost enjoyably. Shackleton made sure of that. Each man was assigned a group of dogs to look after and exercise. The tough old sailors fussed over the dogs. It fulfilled that basic human need to care for something, the desire to express tenderness in a barren place. There were poetry readings, musical evenings, and games.
A few days ago, Captain Worsley amused the men by running out onto the floe in a state of nature.
It seems boys will be boys, whatever the circumstances.
Today, a morale boost was needed again, so I asked Captain Worsley for the honor of a dance, and we waltzed on the ice while the crew whistled. Morale was soon up again.
The crew, I think almost without exception, had very deep affection for Shackleton because he understood them. And the other thing was he was very good at bringing out the best in people. So he encouraged people very positively. And he, I think, encouraged people to do things that they didn't believe they were capable of. And in terms of just sheer courage and endurance, some of the crew members, I'm sure, far exceeded their own expectations of what they could put up with under those appalling conditions.
Entertaining distractions could not hide the fact that the ice had been increasing its grip on the ship. One night, a band of penguins approached the Endurance and gave an eerie cry. Some of the more superstitious of the crew felt that this was an omen. The pressure of the ice had become too much for the little ship. She was breaking up. The Endurance had been a symbol that linked them to the outside world. Its breakup severed their last link with civilization.
It was a sickening sensation to feel the decks
breaking up under our feet. The great beams bending and then snapping with a noise like heavy gunfire. Her timbers cracking and her wounds gaping, she slowly gave up her sentient life at the very outset of her career. I cannot describe the impression of relentless destruction that was forced upon me as I looked down and around. The floes, with the force of millions of tons of moving ice behind them, have annihilated my ship. It's hard to say what I feel. To a sailor, his ship is more than a floating home.
Shackleton's grand expedition was over, but his great adventure was just beginning. He at once set a tone that was reassuring.
A man must make himself a new mark directly the old one goes to ground. So, gentlemen, ship and stores are gone, so now we'll go home.
But home was on the other side of the world, and even the nearest human settlement lay thousands of miles away. Shackleton must have known that the prospects of survival were slim, but in company he had no option. He would have to ignore the problems entirely. They loaded 3 lifeboats with stores and started to tow them across the ice, hoping to get to open water. The plan was to get to Paulette Island, 350 miles away, where there were supplies and there may be a chance of rescue.
Towing things across snow and ice is much harder than you might imagine. The snow and ice are not as slippery as you expect. It's more like pulling heavy things across sand. When we pulled our sledges, each one of us was pulling around 500 pounds. And to drag that takes all your effort, even on the flat, and it's not flat. For Shackleton with his boats, each boat was enormously heavy. There were many men on each boat, but they'd have been working to the same extent, flat out, basically. You get terrible sores around the top of your legs, around your armpits, your toes get frostbitten and infected. Your feet then get swollen and your boots don't fit anymore. It's really very uncomfortable indeed for a lot of the time. And because of that, you weaken physically as days go by. If you're keeping moving, you can sustain things. When you stop, it's misery.
But they had no choice. They had to stop. The boats were too heavy. They would have to trust their lives to chance and set up camp on the drifting ice.
The ice drifting northwards will either take us nearer land, or we will be swept into the South Atlantic. The monotony is unbearable.
But after 3 months drifting, there was no sight of land or open water, and food was running out. For Shackleton, a man of action, doing nothing was the ultimate frustration.
Waiting, waiting, waiting.
He had never lost a man under his command. To keep that record would be the last ambition to be salvaged from disaster.
I pray God I can manage to get the whole party to civilization.
The remaining dogs, the crew's loyal companions, were shot and eaten. For many of the men, despite their awful condition, this was the lowest point of the journey. But after 4 months drifting hopelessly, the ice began to break up.
One of the ice floes split down the middle through someone's tent, a guy called Holness. He dropped straight down into the icy waters of the Antarctic. Someone grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, or by the sleeping bag, hauled him out, and the two halves of the ice floe, having split seconds before, came back together again. And who was the guy in the middle of the night who was watching? Shackleton. So I think they knew that he'd always look after them.
At least they could now launch the boats and head for Paulette Island. They were all overjoyed that at last they could escape from the ice. But the current took them past Paulette Island into stormy seas. A hellish 7-day journey followed, but finally they stumbled onto the beach at Elephant Island. They had not set foot on land for a year and a half. They were ecstatic.
Some of the men were reeling about the beach as if they'd found an unlimited supply of alcoholic liquor. They were laughing uproariously, picking up stones and letting pebbles trickle through their fingers like misers gloating over hoarded gold. The smiles and laughter and the gleeful exclamation at the sight of 2 live seals on the beach made me think of that glittering hour of childhood, when the door is open at last and the Christmas tree in all its wonder bursts upon the vision.
On solid ground, many of the crew thought they were safe at last.
In March this year, I had my first view of Elephant Island. I can't say it was a pleasure. Historically, yes, but I've never seen such a godforsaken lump of rock in my life. I saw it about 5 o'clock in the morning. We had very rough seas. It was sort of shrouded in mist. And it is very hard to understand the fantastic excitement which Shackleton and his crew displayed when they actually set foot on land there.
But it soon became clear that the island was so isolated that no rescue team would think of looking for them there. They would all go insane or starve. After 5 days in awful conditions, there was only one course of action. Someone would have to go for help.
April 24th, 1916. We began our fateful 800-mile journey across the South Atlantic in winter to the nearest human settlement on South Georgia. On this, all our lives depend.
As experienced seamen, they all knew that this trip was suicidal. The 20-foot James Caird was barely fit for such a journey. Shackleton took 5 men, leaving behind the rest of the crew. Many thought they would never see the 6 men again. Sailing across the stormiest seas in the world to find the small island of South Georgia would require incredible skills of navigation.
The tale of the next 16 days is one of supreme strife amidst heaving waters. The sub-Antarctic Ocean lived up to its evil reputation, the ocean that is open to all and merciful to none, that threatens even when it seems to yield and is pitiless to weakness.
One night they encountered a wave so huge it blotted out the sky.
During 26 years' experience of the ocean in all its moods, I had never encountered a wave so gigantic. It was a mighty upheaval of the ocean. A thing quite apart from the white-capped seas that had been our tireless enemies for so many days. I shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." Then came a moment of suspense. It seemed drawn out into hours. We felt our boat lifted and flung forward like a cork on a breaking surf. We bailed with the energy of men fighting for life. After what seemed like hours of uncertainty, we felt the boat renew her life beneath us. She floated again, dazed by the attack from the sea.
When you sail down the South Atlantic to say around 40 degrees south, the further you go into the Southern Ocean, you can feel the coldness coming on. It gets very, very cold. You've got these mountainous seas that's got no land in front of them, so they just keep rolling around Antarctica. You've got these big storms that build up off of Antarctica and roll out into the Southern Ocean, which create massive waves, which can be incredibly dangerous. If you could imagine driving along the motorway and you go under a motorway bridge, and if you could imagine that that bridge is 3 times or 4 times higher into the sky, and that's a wall of solid water, of sea, rushing at you, it would be terrifying for anybody, and not many people can live through it. And all you can do in those kind of conditions is hope for the best.
During the harrowing journey, they were followed by an albatross. The ease with which it swept the miles aside filled them with envy. But finally, on the 8th of May, they spotted land. They had reached South Georgia. But as they approached the island, a hurricane blew up and pushed the battered boat towards the cliffs.
The chance of surviving the night with the driving gale and implacable sea forcing us onto a lee shore seemed small. I think most of us had the feeling that the end was very near.
But the same good luck that spat them out of the monster wave struck again. At the last moment, the wind veered round and blew them away from the cliffs. On the 16th day, they landed in South Georgia, ending one of the greatest small boat journeys in seafaring history.
I understand that somebody said, 16 days, it wasn't all that long. But I don't think they really understand what 16 days in the Southern Ocean is all about. 16 days in the Southern Ocean is like 16 light years in the universe, when you consider that 16 days of continuous battering by mountainous seas, freezing cold, high winds, your navigation has got to be as right as it can, and any moment you can have one of those 100-foot waves come along and just swallow you up, and you've gone. 16 days is surely a lifetime.
As they stepped ashore, they all shook hands. But they had landed on the uninhabited side of the island. The whaling station still lay 30 miles away, and the only way to safety was to cross the island by foot. Shackleton and his men had no maps, no mountaineering equipment, and they were exhausted.
I have been to South Georgia, and there are some pretty impressive mountains there. However, I don't really think that the route followed by Shackleton would be regarded as a difficult technical route by the modern mountaineer. But to people who'd just sailed across the ocean, who were tired, washed out, and not terribly experienced, it must have been a tremendous challenge.
Taking the remaining rations and pushing nails from the James Caird through their shoes for grip, Shackleton, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean began their trek, leaving behind the other three who were too sick to walk. Having come this far, they were not going to give up.
I think a lot of it really is motivation. If you simply want to get there and have to get there, you'll make the effort using what equipment you have. That's really what Shackleton did. He wasn't equipped to do such a thing, but he did have that strong motivation. A man who would take risks when they had to be taken.
I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours across the unnamed mountains and glaciers, it seemed to me that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions at that point, but afterwards, Worsley said to me, "Boss?" I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person walking with us. Crean confessed the same idea. All 3 of us felt it.
Shackleton's extra man, as they cross South Georgia, is a phenomenon that's been described by other travellers that have undergone extreme hardship for a long time. I can't say I've ever felt it myself, and I guess it's a kind of daydream, but I don't know of any medical explanation as to why another person should appear.
I always remember we went to Shackleton's hut on Scott Island. I opened the door of this rather shabby little hut and went inside, and I immediately had a strange feeling. I had a feeling as though I could see Shackleton walking across the hut towards me with his hand outstretched to welcome me. And it really was an amazing sensation. And the other people who were with me, when they came in, they had a similar feeling. They really felt that the Shackleton spirit, perhaps, was still there waiting to welcome us. It was really an amazing experience.
They scaled 3 high peaks only to find there was no way down and had to retrace their steps.
Finally, at the top of one of the mountains, with night falling, I realized that if we didn't get down rapidly, we would all freeze. There was only one thing for it: slide.
Shackleton didn't allow them time to reflect on the danger of this. But in minutes they descended a mile and came to rest in a snowdrift. Early next morning, Shackleton heard a distant sound. It could be the wake-up call for the whaling station. If he hadn't imagined it, he knew it would sound again at 7 o'clock and confirm they were close to safety.
In intense excitement, we waited for 7 o'clock, when the whalers would be summoned to work. was a moment hard to describe. Never had any of us heard sweeter music.
This was the first sound of the outside world they had heard in 17 months. Later that day, on the 20th of May 1916, after a 36-hour trek, 3 bedraggled strangers walked into the whaling station at Stromness, South Georgia. Shackleton and his men were safe at last.
It was a splendid moment.
I've always had the attitude that if you've got yourself into a difficult situation, it's not really much good praying for someone to get you out of it. I think it's up to you to make a major effort and get yourself out of that difficult situation. I'm inclined to think probably that Shackleton had a similar approach.
Shackleton collected the 3 men on the other side of South Georgia and then made 3 attempts to rescue the men on Elephant Island, but he was driven back every time by the ice. He was terrified that the crew would all die of starvation before he could reach them.
The mind boggles as to how they managed to survive those 4 months, and they were winter months. I mean, they could have eaten each other, or they could have done all sorts of horrible things. Wilde was in charge, so Shackleton, second in command, he was left behind. Every day he got them up, they could pack up their belongings and get ready, and said, you know, the boss may come back today. The boss was the name they gave to Shackleton. And again, there was this air of expectation, hope, optimism, which I think saw them through. They never, I don't think they actually believed that Shackleton wouldn't come and rescue them, which was great. I mean, that kept them going, I think.
By August, with no news, there was a creeping awareness that the boss was never coming back. One of the men wrote in his diary, "It's no use deceiving ourselves any longer." But on the 30th of August 1916, a boat sailed into the bay at Elephant Island. As Shackleton rowed ashore, he thought he might be too late.
I saw they'd hoisted a flag, an old Burberry shirt, but it was flying at half-mast, so I shouted, "Are you all well?" And the reply came back, "All well, boss." I could barely speak for the sense of relief. The feeling of seeing all 22 of my men alive was indescribable.
Two years after they had set sail on the Endurance, they returned to civilization and were hailed as heroes. But time had stood still for Shackleton and his men. In their absence, the world had gone mad. The 28 men had survived against all odds. Yet within weeks of their return, 2 of them had been killed in action. One shot at the front, the other drowned when his ship was torpedoed. The First World War ended the heroic age of exploration and changed the notion of heroism forever. After the war, Shackleton grew restless, and so in 1922 he headed south again on a 4th Antarctic expedition. Many of his old crew went with him. This is the last photo taken of Ernest Shackleton. He died of a heart attack on his ship off South Georgia.
I think the Antarctic was calling him back again. So he organized an expedition which one just wonders, did he know it was going to be his last expedition? He wasn't in good health, although he didn't really show it. Maybe he knew he'd never come back. I mean, we don't know, he didn't say that, but his ending was highly appropriate. There couldn't be a better burial ground for him amongst the Norwegian whalers who respected and admired him so much, under the shadow of those big high mountains which he crossed in South Georgia.
Ernest Shackleton failed completely at his expedition's original objective, but he had done much more. His story is not one of imperial triumph, but of human survival and human endurance.
Just when things look their worst, they change for the best. I marvel at the thin line that divides success and failure.
To my mind, and I think to most people who know anything about polar exploration, Shackleton is a hero. He's undertaken incredible feats, some of them sort of by accident, if you like, but I think probably stands above everybody else, really, even if he didn't ever attain the goals he wished to make.
I think it helps to be a slightly lucky person. But on the other hand, I don't think it's all luck by any man of means. I don't think, for instance, that Shackleton survived just on luck. I mean, he survived because he was a brave man. He was a man with courage and good judgment, a man who was determined to get his team to safety.
And that was the achievement that mattered to him most.
Not a life lost. And we had been through hell.
There is a saying amongst explorers: for scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton.